The next day, early morning, Luke took a deep breath and lifted his head from Malena's full breasts. The world was bleak, and the hearts of the people were cold. Only bed activities could provide some warmth. I wanted to exercise in the morning. Luke couldn't help but feel a little pity when he saw the afterglow of the woman beside his pillow and seemed to be still immersed in a sweet dream. Although Malena worked hard, last night's exercise wasn't gratifying. He was reaching down and pulling up the thin quilt that had slipped off to cover the Sicilian darling's shoulder. Luke rolled out of bed and went into the bathroom. After washing, he opened the heavy curtains that blocked the light to welcome the rising sun of a new day. This kind of quiet life is desirable. Luke began to stretch his muscles. After becoming a Superman, he still hadn't put down his 100 push-ups and 100 sit-ups routine. He ordered breakfast through room service. After enjoying the meal, Luke kissed a sleepy Malena on the forehead and walked out the door in his Major General's uniform. Stark Industries. When he got into the black sedan, Luke told the driver the location. He was going to talk business with Howard. Only with sufficient funding to keep S.H.I.E.L.D. running properly, it could escape from the constraints of the White House and the Pentagon completely. Otherwise, while the purse was held in someone else's hand, he wouldn't even have the right to speak. Stark Industries building was located on 5th Avenue in Manhattan. It stood opposite the Empire State Building, which was currently the tallest building in the world. Luke's clothes were conspicuous, like an unimpeded entry permit. "Why do you have time to visit me today, Major General Cavill? Damn, you're moving up faster than a rocket." Howard, who had a mustache, smiled and brought over 2 glasses of whiskey. The receptionist called a long time ago to say that an unusually young military major general had come to visit. Howard knew who it was with little thought. "I just had to come back to New York, so I'm here." "Drinking in broad daylight, you have indulged." Luke took the glass and looked at Howard with his legs crossed. Because the Manhattan Project was disclosed, the other party was in the limelight recently. He's much more popular than the out-of-fashion Captain America and Superman, who gradually reduced their public appearances. "You don't understand, Luke. This is a sign of inner emptiness." Howard drank a mouthful. With a lazy look, he frowned and said, "If there's a goddess of wisdom in this world, then I think she has already left me. Ever since the Manhattan Project's research group was disbanded, my heart has been empty, and no number of women can fill it." Luke raised his eyebrows and smiled. "You look pretty ill." "Yes, that's what Jarvis said. I even had sex with 3 pretty girls at once, but it still didn't work." Howard looked at the ceiling and spoke with a melancholy expression. "After a short period of pleasure, there's an endless emptiness. Everything is so dull and tasteless." Seeing Howard almost speaking like a sage, Luke shook his head and laughed. The Stark family father and son were the same. The difference is that every time Tony was in high spirits, he would go to his underground tinkering room to play with those machines and vent his sense of excitement and energy. After studying the atom, his father seems to have lost interest in ordinary things. "Can the Tesseract interest you and bring back your desire for knowledge and vitality?" Luke took a sip of whiskey. As if he saw a fish on the hook, he lightly said, "I remember you were interested in it." The lonely and empty Howard suddenly turned over and sat up. His eyes instantly regained their light, and he rubbed his hands with passion. He asked, "When do we start?" "After you join S.H.I.E.L.D. The Tesseract is a top-ranking item. Access wouldn't be granted by non-personnel." Luke threw out the conditions. Now, he thought it would be better for Nick Fury, the third-generation director. Carter and Howard laid the foundation, and Alexander Pierce laid the framework. Wait until the hard-boiled egg director is on top. It could be said, he only needed to sit on his hands and think of various ways to appropriate public funds. S.H.I.E.L.D., the reorganized Strategic Science Reserve? No problem? Howard didn't think much and nodded quickly. He was almost like a sage and desperately needed a challenging problem to stimulate his empty mind. Luke was quite satisfied. Bringing Howard in was great. Human resources +5. S.H.I.E.L.D. scientific research strength +5. Capital reserves +10. Wait, you didn't come to see me today just to get me into S.H.I.E.L.D., did you? After nodding in agreement, Howard seemed to react and looked at Luke with eyes as if he was looking at a schemer. "Give me back my feelings." The Tesseract, for a scientific research consultant title, you're not losing anything. Luke ignored Howard's complaint and continued, "Back to the topic. I came to see you today for other things too. I want to talk business with you." When it came to business, science, and women, Howard usually showed 100% seriousness. After thinking for a moment, He thought carefully and said, "Talking about business, Stark Industries recently won 2 orders from the Defense Department, and its military factory and weapons research and development center is saturated in industry. If you are short of money, I can." "Howard, you misunderstood my meaning." Luke waved his hand to interrupt the other party's words. As a businessman in the helm of a military enterprise, any judgment Howard made should be based on a reasonable consideration of the company's interests. "This is correct and won't make him unhappy. I'm not short of money." Luke put down his glass, leaned back on the sofa, and uttered this somewhat ostentatious truth. Before going out, Colonel Phillips called and told him some good news. The funding for SHIELD has been approved, and the site has been confirmed. Now Luke has an enormous budget of $16 million, so he wasn't short of money. $10 million in this era was plenty enough. Although it is not his personal property, as SHIELD director, embezzlement of public funds was naturally a traditional niche, there would be no problem. Congress did me the honor of not letting SHIELD stay in the same dilapidated building as the FBI. Luke said this because intelligence agencies such as the FBI and CIA were established to work in a few old apartments near the White House, and the funding allocated to their activities was only $450,000. Compared to them, SHIELD has been very well favored. "Well, it looks like you want to talk business." Howard shrugged his shoulders and corrected his attitude. "Let me hear what the youngest major general on American soil, and the greatest war hero of all time, has to say about his ideas for making money. Does Stark Industries have any idea of entering the communications industry?" Luke was ready to build mobile phones and communication networks before the age of communication would arrive. The reason why he thought this way was simply because he wasn't used to the era when information transmission was too backward. In the 1940s, Bell Telephone Laboratories in the United States manufactured the first digital scrambled speech transmission system. In 1958, Leonid Kuprianovich, an engineer of the Soviet Union, made further improvements to the handheld transceiver, reducing the weight from 3 kilograms to 500 grams. The wireless phone, the size of bricks, had to wait until 1973 when researched by an engineering technician from Motorola, Martin Cooper. The current communications industry was like a gold mine waiting to be mined. Communications industry. AT&T has already done it. They have the core technology from Bell Labs. Even if Stark Industries enters, they may not be able to compete. Howard shook his head repeatedly when he heard Luke's proposal. The Department of Defense's contracts were not as good as those of the communications industry. Moreover, the initial investment was enormous. Laying cables and building communication systems were all necessary tasks that would take a lot of time and cost. The most important thing was that Stark Industries had to face the terrifying enemy, Bell Labs. Even with Howard's critical eye, he had to admit that it was the most extraordinary laboratory in the world. It may not be as good as the Manhattan Project, where talents and geniuses from all over the world come together. But it could also be called a pool of talents, which shouldn't be underestimated. Unlike his son, Howard occasionally sprang up with naive, idealistic romanticism. For example, give up the company's main activities, close the weapons manufacturing plant, put on the iron armor as a superhero, and so on. As a businessman, Howard was very rational. He wasn't optimistic about Luke's proposal. He thought that the communications field wasn't an excellent choice to expand the industry. "Don't be in a hurry to answer yet. Read my proposal before you say anything." Luke wouldn't come empty-handed since he wanted Howard to cooperate. With his super brain, quick thinking, and previous knowledge of related technologies, he spent several days working out a plan. Frankly speaking, once Superman used his brain, he could surpass over 90% of the world's geniuses. It was like turning on the grappling hook and frantically climbing on the technology tree. In the same 24 hours, Luke seemed to become +1 in intelligence every second. It was a complex problem to solve. He could get the answer after a few glances. Bell Labs is indeed the greatest laboratory on the planet, but this doesn't mean that AT&T could always monopolize the communications industry. While Howard was reading the plan, Luke explained his thoughts. "You may not have noticed. As more and more people own cars due to the development of the automobile industry, mobile phones are in high demand, and communication is no longer limited to the home. According to my plan, Stark Industries will surely open a new era of mobile communication, and even AT&T, supported by Bell Labs, may not be an opponent." Luke certainly knew that AT&T had a trump card, Bell Labs. There have been 11 Nobel Prize winners in physics, 4 Turing Awards winners, and 16 winners of America's highest scientific awards. since its establishment has obtained more than 30,000 patents, with an average of 1 patent per day. Many critical technologies of computers, televisions, mobile phones, cameras, and the internet in future generations would come from Bell Labs. It's no exaggeration to say that it changed the world. In the original timeline, AT&T relied on Bell Labs to dominate the communications industry for more than 100 years, and it had always been the leader. No one could surpass it. It's unlikely that the communications empire built by Bell Labs would have collapsed, had it not been for the subsequent anti-monopoly laws that led to the dismantling and dismemberment of the giant. What Luke wanted to do is to take the lead in bringing the era of mobile communication, but with the help of Stark Industries' power to easily arrange it. It would be pervasive in every household, from communication services to the internet, mobile, and TV. As long as this business is done, it wouldn't be worse than Stark Industries' businesses. Did you do this all by yourself? Howard listened and flipped through the plan. The expression on his face changed, from the first careless to the later serious. Halfway through, as the most successful weapons tycoon in the country, his breathing became heavy, and his speed of turning the pages became faster and faster. Luke, you know, because of you, for the first time, I feel that God isn't fair. Half an hour later, Howard spoke in a complicated tone. There was a surprise, excitement, and a hint of disbelief in his eyes. I've never been jealous of your Superman physique, except when faced with too many pretty girls and being a little overwhelmed. I've always been proud of my genius brain too, but you've refreshed my perception today. It's not that you found any novel technology or made some amazing breakthrough. Instead, your vision is completely beyond this era. This plan is like a key to the future 50 years from now. Luke shrugged his shoulders and leisurely took in Howard's restless excitement. He thought that this was only the essential operation of someone traveling worlds. If he wanted to defeat Bell Labs, which was famous in the world, of course, he had to pull up the technological achievements of the same era. Besides, could a world traverser be regarded as a plagiarizer? This was only a good advantage, leading the technological innovation in advance. Luke reassured himself. That's not scientific. I don't mean to be rude, but Luke, you didn't even go to college. How did you come up with this? Howard gripped the thick project proposal and paced back and forth to calm his mood. This thick stack of paper simply depicted a blueprint for the future of the communication era. From the internal integrated chips, precision parts to the core technology of analog signal and frequency diversity, multiple access, even encrypted channels, automatic connection, etc. Including the establishment of urban communication networks, the development of cellular mobile communication networks in the later period, and mobile phones. Such content filled 50 to 60 pages. The dense and extensive arguments had almost mapped out development for the next 20 or 50 years. That's why Howard was shocked. Luke gave him not just one single technological invention but a path forward for the entire industry. Did you come back from the future in a time machine? Howard took a deep breath and stared at Luke sitting on the sofa to find out the honest answer from the other party. Yeah. The future world is fated to be ruled by artificial intelligence. To stop its evil plan to enslave humankind, I lead the resistance to build a time machine and use it to go back to the World War II era. This is my biggest secret. Don't tell anyone because it may attract danger. Luke was talking nonsense with an earnest look. Howard's half-believing expression amused him. Forget it. Only having one genius in this world doesn't make sense. Well, Luke, welcome to the Genius Club. I'll give you credit for that. After a long time, Howard shook his head and sighed, seemingly somewhat dejected. Now, even the proudest genius had lost the capital to show off in front of Luke, which was depressing. How do you want to collaborate? Howard, who had calmed down, began to test Luke's bottom line. He had no interest in the communications industry and didn't think Stark Industries would beat Bell Labs for the market share of U.S. telephone and telegraph companies. But things were different now. With this plan, not to mention taking over the market, Howard was even confident in building a communications empire. I'll take 60% of the shares with the technology. Stark Industries will put in the capital and can take the remaining 30%, and give the rest away. The establishment of a mobile communications network must have government support. Luke didn't beat around the bush and spoke bluntly. He took a fancy to the substantial financial resources of Stark Industries and the deep foundation behind it. If the communication industry was to develop, it must have the support of the government. Although Luke had a place in the military, he was weak in politics. As long as Stark Industries was in the market, its development wouldn't have any difficulties in the later periods. It makes sense. With your proposal, your design, and technology, Stark Industries quickly picked up a bargain. Howard nodded and agreed to this simple distribution plan. If there's a change in the terms and conditions, it had to be done later. In that case, let's have good cooperation. Luke smiled and held out his hand, which Howard held tightly. The two looked at each other with a smile and seemed to see the arrival of a new era. After agreeing to finalize the cooperation, Luke and Howard had a detailed discussion on some specific issues. To complete the initial establishment of a mobile communication system, strong support from the government was needed. Next, the public relations team of Stark Industries would meet with the mayor and various council members to obtain preferential policies and tax exemptions. It's best to get a few trial runs to see how it works. To sum it up, this was a massive project. It would take at least 2 to 3 years for the early industrial layout and urban communication network to be laid, not including the obstruction of the competitor, AT&T. Howard didn't care about short-term interests, he was more interested in the prospects of the communication industry. Although the contents in the plan seemed to be ahead of schedule, on reflection, Howard thought it was more like an accurate prediction. Considering the anti-monopoly bill, I think the communications business shouldn't be placed under Stark Industries' name. Howard was cautious, and he proved to be correct. AT&T, which originally monopolized 80% of the market, was forced to split into more than a dozen subsidiaries under the pressure of the anti-monopoly bill, thus going down. You can't ask me to start a company as a major general, it won't look good. Luke curled his lips. His mind flashed, saying, if we have to deal with the anti-monopoly bill, you can send a representative, and I will send another representative to set up a new company together. Howard gave a crisp snap of his fingers in agreement. What's the name of the new company? He asked. Skynet. Out of bad taste, Luke came up with such a name. Does the name have any other meaning? It looks like you've already thought of it. Howard frowned. Luke's image became more and more mysterious in his mind. So much so that this weapons tycoon began to doubt the bullshit rhetoric of going back in time with a time machine. After all, there had been so many incredible miracles involving the other party. Before that, no one could have imagined that the war would end in the hands of one person. You wouldn't understand if I told you. Luke shook his head regretfully, citing movies and stories lose half the fun if the other party didn't know it. Well, what are you going to do next? From what I know about you, Luke, you don't seem like a quiet guy. Howard didn't bother to inquire too deep. Everyone had secrets, so there's no need to get to the bottom of it. After the war, Rogers lost his goal, and I was in a void. Why don't you look like you're in any of these situations? Luke smiled at this question. He had so many things to do that he's almost overwhelmed. Develop S.H.I.E.L.D. to get rid of the constraints of the White House and the military as soon as possible. Gather the mutants, bring down the Hellfire Club, and get rid of Sebastian Shaw. Get even with Hydra. How and collect information about the Inhumans to avoid them living on the moon and becoming ticking time bombs. If he had time, he should take the initiative to go to Karmatage to talk to the Sorcerer Supreme and confirm whether the other party was hostile. There were so many things waiting for Luke to deal with or plan, how could he have no goal? He had always been a man who disliked being passive, rather than waiting for reality to come to pass, and revel in frustration. Luke preferred to take the initiative and be fully prepared for anything. Only in this way could he feel safe as a traverser. To put it simply, the young Major General had a strong desire for control and wanted to bring all the changes under his control. In essence, this was somewhat similar to Batman, with countless plans in his head. They were both suffering from severe persecution paranoia and needed psychological treatment. I'm looking forward to the future, Howard, because it was wonderful. Luke replied vaguely. Is that so? I think you look like a cheating student who knows the answer and can't wait for the test to start. Howard's observation ability was quite sharp. He continued, back to the topic, I also hope that the Tesseract can stimulate my genius, stimulate my inspiration, and keep me from being so sluggish. Addicted to alcohol and women. This life is too boring, it's not the life I'm looking for. Howard, who got out of his descent to sagehood, looked upright. It looked as if he wasn't the one who rolled in the sheets with 3 beautiful girls a few days ago. Trust me. Soon, your self-confidence will be shattered by the Tesseract. Luke gloated. Studying the Infinity Stones is difficult. Even back then, 2 famous geniuses in the Marvel world, Tony Stark and Banner Bruce, Iron Man and Hulk, joined forces and spent a lot of time trying to understand the Mind Stone thoroughly, but created Ultron, that filial son. We'll see what happens. Howard himself was full of confidence, but his eyes couldn't hide his tired look. In addition, I think you should find a managing CEO. Business management will consume most of your energy, and you can't concentrate on the research. Luke warned aloud when he saw the other person rubbing his swollen temples, excessively using his brain. He remembered Iron Man's father. There should be a bald partner who had always been there. Obadiah Stane, the villain who almost made Stark Industries change its leadership and provided experience value for Iron Man. I'm also looking for the right person for the job. I intend to devote 100% of my energy and time to the Tesseract research, and I intend to hand over the management of the company to professionals. Howard, who held several meetings in succession today, leaned against the wide and comfortable leather seat. Stark's industry was on the right track, and it only needed to develop steadily step by step. Sooner or later, it could surpass those old military enterprises, so he was ready to devote his thoughts to the places he was more interested in. For example, studying the Tesseract. By the way, where's Rogers? I heard that he has gone through a second transformation and his chest muscles are even stronger than before. After talking about work, Howard began to chat. He was also a well-informed person and had long heard about the subsequent events on the European battlefield. Steve. He is considering whether to retire honorably and then return to Brooklyn to be an ordinary person. Do you think a super soldier could adapt to the life of mowing the lawn and watching football games at home? Luke shook his glass. He wanted to bring Captain America in and add Howard to form the first generation of the Avengers. The world's first superhero band to debut sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? However, after the war, there were no decent opponents at all. He still didn't know where Sebastian Shaw and the Hellfire Club were. As a villain, Luke was disappointed because that guy didn't have the spirit to make any mischief. As for Hydra, Baron Strucker had disappeared after bringing down the wickedness of the Third Empire. With all due respect to Rogers, he never wanted to admit the fact that he was different from the rest of the world. Howard took out a box of cigars and lit them with long matches. He said, "In fact, super soldiers like you are essentially different from us. Isn't it funny that you can lift a car, punch through steel plates, and still pretend to be normal? Luke, do you know what I admire most about you? As Superman, you never hide, and you don't intend to package yourself as a harmless and benign figure. This is the reason why the military is lenient with you. I remember they had planned to hold a hearing to ask you about your suit and other questions, but it ended in vain. Because some people said, what if Superman refuses the summons? Do we have the means to compel him to submit to the will of the country?" Luke put down his glass. He had heard Colonel Phillips say it. After the public debut in Berlin, many people were interested in his Kryptonian battlesuit, the ability to fly, and the disposable Green Lantern corpse disc. To be honest, if they do hold a hearing, I will be there on time. The corners of Luke's mouth pursed slightly and gently said, I asked Dr. Zola to improve Woden's blood, thus gaining more power and being able to get rid of gravity. It makes sense, right? Hydra secretly developed a high-tech battlesuit that is extremely bulletproof and can automatically repair itself, right? As for me destroying a bomber group alone in Berlin, most of it is Steve's credit. Those bombers were shot down by him standing on the Eiffel Tower. It's a pity that you missed it. The scene was spectacular. Captain America was shooting down the planes. You see, there are reasonable explanations for all these problems. Even after I returned to New York, the military arranged to take a blood sample from me, and I didn't resist. Luke spread out his hands and spoke with a smile on his face. Am I not cooperating enough? Howard narrowed his eyes and asked curiously, what if the military asks you to hand in your battlesuit or participate in the research to replicate the super soldier? They won't do that. Why? Welcoming Howard's wondering eyes, Luke frankly said, have you heard the story of Gordian knot? Legend has it that Gordian was the king of Phrygia in ancient Greece. He made a complicated knot on an ox cart he used before and put it in the temple of Zeus, saying that those who can untie this knot would rule the continent. Then Alexander the Great cut off the complicated knot with his sword. The young major general sitting on the sofa smiled and said, I learned from this story that if you can't solve a complicated problem, then find the root cause and eliminate the person who raised the problem. So, the president or the legislators better not give me any problems. After listening, Howard was speechless. Fortunately, the congressmen in Capitol Hill weren't stupid enough to cause trouble for the other party. Time's always passing without a sound, and it wasn't easy to notice. After the end of the war, the people of New York were finally able to live a quiet life. They no longer had to worry about food shortages or the tragic fate of being relegated to the lower class. In its place, factory workers were brutally exploited by their bosses, and there were severe livelihood problems. But in one respect, they were better than their 20th century descendants. Now the people of New York at least didn't have to put up with masked weirdos flying around overhead, and they didn't have to worry about a sudden attack by an alien fleet. A peaceful day was typical for everyone. 2 months later, Luke flew back to Washington, D.C. from Manhattan and showed up at the door of SHIELD's headquarters. Stark Industries quickly produced a prototype based on the detailed design drawings during this not too long and not too short period. The mobile phone, which was supposed to be available only in 1973, came out ahead of schedule. Although not yet in production, the rapid arrival of the era of mobile communications could already be foreseen. Luke had to lament about this. The father and son of the Stark family, both of whom were very active, never left any problem for the next day. For the sake of the initial stage in entrepreneurship, I reluctantly put up with it. Luke stood at SHIELD headquarters in Potomac Shores, shaking his head and sighing. Compared to the crowded Pentagon, the 39-story building in front of him looks a bit shabby indeed. General. Good morning. Holding his head high, Luke walked into the Grand Hall and saw a vibrant group of young agents. They all habitually refer to him as General, not Director. Shaking a habit is not easy. Luke took the elevator and went all the way up. After the official establishment of SHIELD, Carter, as the head administrator, took the initiative to request the FBI and CIA to provide human resources and reinforcements. In this way, a lot of elites have been drawn from those intelligence agencies. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had also gone to the president to complain about this. He said that Major General Cavill received so much funding but still came to steal his staff. Wasn't this bullying honest people? CIA, not yet called by that name, the correct term is Office of Strategic Services, head, Roscoe Hillenkotter also nodded aggressively at the same time. At least he was also a rear admiral. His rank isn't any lower than Major General Cavill. So, how could the other party not even say a word of greeting and directly transferred a group of people away? The president had no choice but to call Luke to the White House, intending to hear his explanation. However, in regards to the above charges, the young general's response was, I greeted, at the last reception, I approached Mr. Hoover and Admiral Hillenkotter and said that SHIELD personnel were tight and wanted to borrow some people. As soon as this remark came out, the heads of both intelligence agencies turned pale. If they didn't know they were no match for Superman, they would have thrown up their fists and charged. Could you take the words said at the wine table seriously? Hoover, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, even publicly took nude pictures of President Roosevelt's wife. Everyone just laughed at it, and no one looked deeper into it. In the end, the matter came to nothing. The president could only reassure the two top administrators of the intelligence agencies and ignore their explicit request for some funding as compensation. Since then, none of the military heads had dared to talk business at the wine table with Luke. After all, if you couldn't mess with him, you can only stay away. I understand the expansion of SHIELD and the necessity to move faster. But don't be so aggressive, and leave the president a little dignity. Luke arrived on the 34th floor and walked into the office to see Carter in a brown dress with black heels. The cold and attractive female agent is now the commander of SHIELD, responsible for internal affairs management, field assignments, and all other tasks. They don't give a damn about SHIELD. Hoover, in particular, touted himself as Washington's secret agent in the shadows. What's the big deal about taking a few nude pictures of the president's wife and knowing about a few Senate scandals? Carter's hands were propped up on the table, and her abundant capital shifted violently, causing Luke to blink a little. The latter made a gesture of surrender and said in a relaxed tone, well, we've offended a lot of people anyway, but Hoover took pictures? The FBI director is a pervert and sexually abnormal. Carter replied with a look of disgust. Luke, who was a member of the popcorn-eating audience, was amazed that this group of bigwigs was at the top of the power pyramid. They were good at juggling their private lives. How is SHIELD doing so far? Luke, as a hands-off manager, had no perception that he was the boss. SHIELD's work was mainly handed over to Carter, and he seldom cared about specific affairs. Facts have proven that the other party had this ability. In just a few months, the whole organization was already on the right track. Not bad. The total number of people is maintained at about 400, most of them are logisticians and clerical staff. The real agents and field agents, added up to less than 100, which also includes overseas spies and agents. Carter said in a very organized manner, handing him a detailed list. As for the Hydra thing you mentioned before, there's no exact news. However, I noticed an oil refining company. According to reliable information, it had received an overseas capital injection from the Soviet Union, which is currently being traced. Luke took the information and scanned through it, memorizing the contents in his head. Carter, sitting in the position of commander of S.H.I.E.L.D., fully demonstrated her smart and capable side. She went on to say, if you look at Dr. Zola's testimony, I have good reason to suspect that Hydra is hiding in the Soviet Union and is in collusion with a group called Leviathan. Luke nodded his head. This coincided with his previous assumptions. After World War II, the Allies won. The Axis camp had fallen apart and lost its potential and possibilities for development in a short period. Like fish on a chopping block, at the mercy of others. If Hydra wanted to grow, it would choose a country with a rapid rise in power and turmoil. We have sacrificed 4 agents during this time, and they all died at the hands of Leviathan. They have an organization called the Red Room, which trains high-quality spies and agents for assassination missions. Carter collected a lot of information. Even the Red Room was dug up. Most people have only heard of the KGB, but they didn't know that there was such a spy training camp hidden in the shadows of the Soviet Union. Well done. Luke complimented. Those were small touches. He was more concerned about the whereabouts of mutants. I heard you found James Howlett? The search for Wolverine's whereabouts was also one of the tasks Luke assigned to S.H.I.E.L.D.? More precisely, we found his brother, Victor Creed. Carter found the profile data, opened it, and read, he should be the mutant you were talking about. Previously, he and James Howlett performed brilliantly in the Normandy landing, but his brother, Victor Creed's character, is much more violent. He disobeyed the orders of his superiors several times and contradicted the officers. Most recently, he killed a senior officer, resisted arrest, and was sentenced to death along with James Howlett. Incredibly, they were both shot in the head but didn't die. Instead, they killed the execution team. This was 4 months ago. Currently, Victor Creed is being held in a military camp in New Jersey, and his brother James Howlett is missing. Luke was standing at the door of a cell in a military camp in New Jersey. General, Victor Creed is locked up here. He is dangerous and aggressive. The military officer behind him warned. He looked at Luke with a look of admiration. To many soldiers, Superman is a great legend and a hero who ended the war. In recent times, Luke had put off many interviews and reduced the number of public appearances to focus on S.H.I.E.L.D.'s work. But his reputation was still growing with each passing day, making him an icon for today's young people. It's okay. Open the door. Luke smiled lightly. Wolverine's brother had a violent temper, which he already knew. The officer pulled out the key and opened the iron cell door. The afternoon sun shone through. He held the gun pouch at his waist with one hand and stood in front of the young general to prevent any incidents. Victor Creed, from Canada. Luke walked into the damp, dark, cramped cell and was greeted by the stench of decay and murky air. He couldn't help raising his eyebrows slightly and raising his hand to cover his mouth and nose, shielding his sense of smell. A tall, rough-faced, tough-looking man with a beard sat in the corner, with heavy handcuffs on his arms and legs. A mouse crawled on his shoulder and let out a squeak. Across the muddy ground, you could still see some scraps of flesh and blood. Wearing a short-sleeved top, he showed off 2 strong arms. Dense bullet holes are visible on them. You are accused of killing a senior officer and have been sentenced to 1,000 hours of being constantly shot at. Tell me, how does that feel? The tall figure blocked the warm sunlight squeezing through the doorway, which annoyed Victor, teasing the mouse. He opened his mouth like a wild animal, showing his white teeth, and said, to be honest, that tickles me a little. Well, I heard that you and James Howlett, your brother, were both extremely talented soldiers who participated in the Normandy landing and survived. Luke continued. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s intelligence work was excellent in that they had almost dug up all the details of this Sabertooth. Simply put, he and Wolverine were half-brothers. The whole childhood story was a very bloody family drama. Wolverine's father is a Canadian businessman with a successful career, but it is a pity that he was cheated on with the estate's groundskeeper. When he was out doing business, the family gardener worked during the day and had worked overtime at night, comforting his lonely wife. The businessman, who later learned of the incident, dismissed the groundskeeper and forgiven his wife. In the end, he didn't expect that one night the drunken groundskeeper Logan caused trouble and accidentally killed the businessman. After experiencing the pain of losing his father, little James triggered his body's ability to grow sharp claws formed by his bones. He used the pair of sharp claws to pierce the groundskeeper's heart, not realizing that the other party was his father. After that, it was the tragic story of Victor, Sabertooth. He escaped with his frightened half-brother, and the two wandered around. The mutant brothers have a powerful ability to heal themselves and age slowly. In search of a way to die or a more exciting life, the two men served multiple tours in the military. From the Civil War to World War I and World War II, they had participated in them all and were veterans of 100 wars. Due to the long period, S.H.I.E.L.D. didn't do a meticulous background check. Part of it is Luke's understanding of the stories in his mind. That's nothing. I've been in more thrilling battles. Victor grimaced, looking up at the two silver stars on his opponent's shoulder patch, and said with disdain, "General, whose ass did you lick to get this position? President? Or is it just a bunch of random military commanders who give orders?" The self-healing ability, combined with long life, made Sabertooth quite disdainful of ordinary people. Just from the appearance, Luke is at most 25 years old. How many wars could he have participated in? How many dangerous life and death scenarios had he experienced? Young, but had a high position. What was the reason? You wouldn't need a brain to figure it out. Show some respect, you cold-blooded monster. Major General Cavill is a war hero decorated by the president, much better than beasts like you. The young officer in front of Luke snapped at him, almost pulling out his pistol and putting a hole in Sabertooth's head. The name, Superman, had long spread all over the country. Luke's merit was even more unquestionable. His idol was slandered. How could he tolerate it? War hero, you're the guy called Superman by Roosevelt and Churchill? Victor squinted his eyes, and only then did he fully see the half-lit, half-dark young face. In vain. Thud. Luke took a step forward, past the young officer, and lifted his right leg without an expression. Before Victor responded, his head was stomped into the concrete wall, creating a conspicuous crater. The military boot crushed the distorted face covered with anger. No matter how the opponent struggled, he couldn't lift it. The force was so strong that it caused a bloody trail on the wall. I appreciate talented and capable people. I don't like to talk nonsense. Luke stood upright and calmly said, I can understand that you're a veteran who has seen war and killings, a beast who has adapted to the law of the jungle. You will inevitably be a little wild. But it's best to distinguish the occasion and identify the target clearly before you show your claws, Victor. The young Major General pressed his foot firmly against Sabertooth, who was emitting a muffled growl. His opponent's hard skull felt like it was about to crack. On his 10 fingers, sharp knife-like nails tore the concrete and scraped out clear marks to vent the innermost fury in his heart. I'll rip your heart out and let you die wailing. He gritted his teeth and snarled. He had always been invincible in battle because of his almost immortal-like self-healing ability and keen beast intuition. As a result, he developed an impulsive, bloodthirsty personality. Simply put, he's a cranky old man. I'm good at communicating with guys like you. The corners of Luke's mouth lifted slightly as he released his right foot from Sabertooth's face. With the sudden release of this cranky old man, he immediately rolled over and got up, his 2 sharp claws raised high. Victor is very confident. Given a second, he could have ripped open the delicate veins in Luke's neck and tasted the incredible sensation of warm blood spurting on his face. On that bearded face, the bloody wounds caused by friction had repaired themselves. This shows how powerful the self-healing ability of his muscular physique is. Too slow. Luke shook his head. This guy was like a feral beast, killing and fighting on instinct. He might be invincible against an ordinary soldier, but when faced with Superman, who took up Deathstroke's Master Assassin card, it was simply clumsy to brush up his proficiency. Snap. The retracted right leg kicked out abruptly, and the air made a loud noise. Like an iron whip, it struck Victor with force. His heavy body, like a cannonball, crashed directly through the concrete wall behind him. If there were no shackles on his hands and feet, the humanoid beast would have flown far away. Cough cough. Victor spat out a bloody spit. His sternum collapsed as if a heavy hammer had hit him. If not for his robust vitality, coupled with the mutant's self-healing ability, this mutant would have died on the spot. Don't think you could be arrogant just because your injuries heal automatically and you can't be killed. If you ever flash your claws at me again, I'll put you in a box, pour a ton of cement over you, and throw you into the Mariana Trench. Luke walked up to the fallen Sabertooth and smiled kindly. Hearing this warning, the cranky old man finally calmed down. A bit of fear appeared in his eyes. Reduced to that point, wouldn't it be worse than death? I'm sorry, General, I shouldn't have offended you. After struggling for 10 seconds, Sabertooth squeezed the words out of his throat. Very good. Luke nodded with satisfaction and praised, it seems that we have reached an agreement, Victor. Luke shows his kind side after getting to know Sabertooth, Victor. He beckoned to the young officer who was standing in the cell in a daze and ordered, get him an ID badge. Victor Creed, a member of SHIELD's task force. As of today, you will continue to serve. Yes, General. Sabertooth, whose sternum had collapsed, coughed twice and slowly rose to his feet. The self-healing ability began to take effect. His shattered bones and injured internal organs healed at an alarming rate. The cranky old man, who had been beaten up a bit, was much more restrained. Most mutants who have never been beaten by society have an inexplicable sense of superiority and consider themselves superior to humans. Sebastian Shaw and his spiritual successor Magneto have relied on this approach to either brainwash or unite a group of compatriots. Trask will definitely like you. Luke saw Sabertooth's self-healing ability and began to think about bringing his brother, Wolverine, into the picture. In this way, he will have the proper people to spar in training the future skill card's proficiency. Sabertooth alone certainly wouldn't last long. With the thick-skinned Wolverine, the pair of brothers could withstand being Luke's punching bag. Although he didn't know who this Trask Luke was talking about, his extremely keen beast intuition warned Sabertooth that it probably wasn't something good. At the thought of being a miserable lab rat, a cold chill ran down his spine. The idea of running away sprouted in his mind. Victor, believe me, it's not a good choice. Luke seems to have guessed it and eloquently said, you will become a wanted criminal of the military. When your photos are published in the newspaper, you will have to face the comprehensive pursuit of SHIELD, the state, and county police. Then you can only hide in the woods and live like a beast. You may not care. After all, you are a beast. But believe me, if you get caught running away again, you'll end up in a horrible situation. I have a scientist named Bolivar Trask who is very interested in mutants. Maybe then we will experiment on you, such as cutting your body in half. Which half will be the first to start healing itself? Perhaps we can cut one, Victor, and end up with two Victors? Wouldn't that be interesting? Sabertooth's hair stood on end, and his heart couldn't restrain the fear. At this time, he realized that the self-healing ability that had allowed him to charge with such abandon on the battlefield could also be turned into a form of torture. This young general is simply the devil. General, I will never run away. Sabertooth gulped, giving a serious expression of guarantee. If Wolverine saw his brother's courteous appearance, he would be shocked. It wasn't his foul-mouthed brother's temperament. He was usually like an explosive barrel full of curses. By the way, what's your name? After a friendly chat with Sabertooth, Luke was ready to fly straight back to New York. Before leaving, he stared at the young officer for a few seconds and vaguely felt that he looked familiar. Report General. My name is William Stryker. The young officer saluted. Is this fate? Luke couldn't help but smile. He harvested Sabertooth, finished the main task, and found the future mutant butcher. Human resources +2. Team strength +1. Stryker, right? How long have you served? Luke asked with great interest. Right now, Stryker hasn't experienced the pain of losing family members, let alone met his fated, perfect creation, Wolverine. The whole person looks like a hot-blooded young man, full of vigor. Reported General, 1 year and 4 months. Luke glanced at the rank on his shoulder, Corporal. It looked like he hadn't been in the military for too long. It's no wonder that he appeared in the new barracks in New Jersey. So, Corporal Stryker, would you be interested in working for me? Luke asked with a smile. This kind of bad habit of collecting plot characters is as addictive as drawing cards. Once you start, you can't stop. He wasn't a stamp collector before, can I? Stryker was so overwhelmed that he even wondered if he heard voices. It was like a fan going to the airport to meet an idol, but the latter said her house is quite extensive. Do you want to? Cough cough, seems to be the wrong metaphor. Anyway, that's probably what it was. Stryker still thinks it's unbelievable. Report to Washington, D.C. next week, Corporal Stryker. Luke didn't bother to say much, leaving a word and directly taking off into the sky. The tall and straight figure tore away with billowing air and disappeared into the clouds, leaving a sea of admiration and eyes looking up at the new barracks in New Jersey. At the same time, Florida has a long coastline of over 1,000 miles, with many islands dotting the blue sea like pearls. This is a resort area with numerous islands that have been kept tranquil and pristine. You could enjoy the charming beach, go boating and surfing at sea, or spend an afternoon at the pier with a fishing rod and then feast at a seafood restaurant. All in all, life had a slow and comfortable pace here, attracting a large number of tourists every year. What a great place to relax and forget your worries. A middle-aged man wearing some sort of strange helmet lamented at a beach bar on Anna Maria Island. He sat by the window with a glass of beer, looked at the strong young man opposite, smiled, and said, "My name is Sebastian Shaw, a tourist on vacation. Do you mind if I sit here?" The strong young man with long black hair, 2 strong arms, and bronze skin shook his head and said, "Be my guest." He seemed to have no desire to talk, and after giving a brief answer, he kept silent. "Where are you from?" "I'm from Europe. I have to say, the war is terrible. Everything is out of control." The middle-aged man, who gave him his name, spoke as if he was talking to himself. "I have seen too many innocent people being persecuted and killed. Not only Jews but also many compatriots with extraordinary abilities." The robust young man looked up and spoke in a low voice, "Mr. Shaw, are you German?" Sebastian nodded his head without concealing it. He sincerely said, "Country, color, ethnicity, these are all external aspects. I'm a scientist, and I follow my heart. The extreme racial theories from the Third Reich are too radical and superficial. Do blonde hair and blue eyes mean perfect blood? That's ridiculous. So, Mr. Shaw, what do you think?" The strong young man seemed to take some interest and asked with a frown. "Of course, it's genes. Only the genes that are engraved in the human body are the true revered spiritual guides." Sebastian was so excited about the conversation that he held up the beer and said, "Genes are constantly evolving. The gift of learning. The ability to adapt to the environment. No, the evolutionary instinct that drove us through genocide, through the Ice Age, through the Black Death. The perfection of a race depends on genes. The Third Reich thinks that Aryans are a higher race, and blonde hair and blue eyes are a sign of perfection, which is foolish. That's just the result of genetic variation and has nothing to do with evolution." The young man was lost in thought. He subconsciously asked, "What is evolution?" "Ability." Sebastian smiled at the corner of his mouth, looked up, and took a sip of beer, saying, "Humans learned to make tools, learned to make fire, and got rid of the primitive era of ignorance. When Prometheus stole fire for the world in mythology, was it only fire he brought with him? No, it was the ability to learn and inspire wisdom. The degree of evolution of a race depends on ability. For example, a longer life, a stronger body, and more difference from others." The young man frowned, oblivious to the fact that the guests in the bar had already gone away. A woman with snow-white skin and an icy face appeared behind him at some point. The woman's fingers were placed near his temples, and his lips were slightly opening and closing, repeating Sebastian's words. "Evolution is cruel, and the higher races should eliminate the inferior races, just as Homo sapiens replaced Neanderthals." Sebastian said with a smile, "Don't you think so, Namor Mackenzie?" The young man's eyes were confused and gradually became empty. After a long time, he nodded with certainty, "That's right. Evolution is cruel." "Does he approve of mutants?" In the luxurious suite at Anna Maria Island's waterfront hotel, a cold, beautiful woman with snow-white skin held a glass of red wine and handed it to Sebastian Shaw. "Namor Mackenzie, unlike ordinary people, isn't mentally fragile. His mind is at my mercy. I can only guide him to believe in the correct theory that mutants are supreme." Sebastian Shaw smiled confidently, took the glass, and said, "Sure. I could see Namor Mackenzie's flaws right away. He isn't a determined person. His face is full of confusion, hesitation, and lack of direction. As a puppet, he is easy to control." The cold woman nodded as she delved into Namor's mind and felt the overwhelming emotion that was evident. "If I hadn't worked with Hydra before, I wouldn't have known that in this world, apart from humans and mutants, there are also Atlanteans. They exist in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean and have never been attacked by outsiders." Sebastian was a little thrilled. He has been hiding with the people from the Hellfire Club since the Third Reich collapsed and disintegrated. This mad scientist wasn't a quiet, mundane type of person. On the contrary, Sebastian is power-hungry and ambitious and has always seen mutants as tools and weapons. Therefore, he hopes to find an opportunity to lead the Hellfire Club towards its rise. But a world where war has just ended, the order is being rebuilt, power is being reshuffled, and there is no room for mutants to develop. Atlanteans live at the bottom of the ocean. Unlike humans, they are born with blue skin and the ability to breathe underwater. Sebastian told her the information he got from Hydra. Namor Mackenzie is an exception. Born from an Atlantean princess and an American naval captain, he had the skin color and appearance of a human and was once discriminated against and banished from Atlantis for this reason. Hydra and Atlantis had contact? The beautiful woman was a bit surprised by the strength of the organization. Although Red Skull lost, Hydra's capabilities were still preserved. They have studied many ancient civilizations of humankind. It isn't surprising for them to know the existence of Atlantis. Sebastian savored his red wine and whispered, "Emma, only relying on mutants won't be enough to fight against the massive society that humans have built up. We need to make them kill each other and consume each other so that we could have a chance. And that's what humans are good at." Emma Frost, the beautiful and cold woman, listened silently. She was the White Queen in Hellfire Club, ranking second only to Sebastian Shaw. She is a rare alpha mutant with similar mental abilities to Professor Baldhead, who can read other people's thoughts and memories and even perform mind control. Had Sebastian Shaw not found a unique material in the Soviet Union that isolates the mind and made a helmet out of it, he could have been restrained by the White Queen, not to mention convincing the other side to join the Hellfire Club. What about Superman? The White Queen turned on the TV and stared at the young Major General's image on the news. Luke Cavill is a formidable opponent, but not as scary as I thought. When I master my abilities, along with your mind control, sooner or later, this Superman will kneel in front of the Hellfire Club. Sebastian's ambition is so intense that he could absorb all forms of abilities, convert them and unleash them. This included electricity, heat, kinetic energy, and so on. It can be said that even if tanks and bombers came together, they might not be able to hurt the Black King of this Hellfire Club. The only drawback may be that Sebastian's energy storage has a limit. Once exceeded, his body would explode, and he would die. I once thought about helping the Third Reich and destroying Luke Cavill. However, at that time, I wasn't able to fully control my ability. Now it's different. I received a greater level of evolution. Sebastian looked out at the night sea, full of ambition. He carefully studied Superman's ability, which is nothing more than a substantial strengthening of physical qualities, in addition to flight and heat vision. He has just the right amount to restrain him. Wait until I convince Namor Mackenzie to join the Hellfire Club and identify himself as a mutant, then go after that Superman. Sebastian looked at the tall figure reflected in front of the floor-to-ceiling window and smiled. By the way, get the Azazel and the others out. Emma, the White Queen, frowned slightly but did not comment. Outside the window, dark clouds gathered slowly. Heavy rain was about to fall. SHIELD Headquarters, Washington, D.C. Luke turned his seat and turned his back to the door. Looking through the French windows, we could see the bright night along the Potomac River. Thoughts arise and fall like waves and settle into a plan. When the night got darker, Luke leaned back in his seat. He seemed to sense something and frowned. The stable space was cut open, and sparks of magic pulsated. The scent of incense from Kathmandu, the chanting of bells and meditation, drifted through. I have been waiting for you, Ancient One. Luke, with a glass of whiskey in his right hand, smiled and said, I thought you would come earlier. For example, in Brooklyn, or Sicily, Rome, or even Paris. I didn't expect our first meeting to be in Washington, D.C. The folding and changing void space opened a circular passage, and a figure in a yellow robe arrived. Lifting the hood that hides her face, a bright and shiny bald head emerged. You knew I would come? The intruder asked with great interest. I was just ready for the day when the Sorcerer Supreme would come to my door. Luke turned his chair, put down his glass, and looked directly at the other person. There will come a time, won't there? What do people like me look like to you? A stowaway, or a visitor from another world? The young Major General didn't conceal his intention and directly asked his question. Since Sorcerer Supreme took the initiative to come to him, she must have understood his identity. Pretending not to know, and continuing to play dumb, will only make the other party look down on her for no reason. In the Marvel studio, bald heads are more difficult to deal with. For example, a mutant professor who is currently still a child. Or perhaps the sorcerer supreme that appeared in front of him. Their presence leaves no doubt that a bald head was most likely a sign of strength. Or, maybe there is some kind of addition to personal strength. Then again, Thanos has no hair, right? And Nick Fury, forget it, the hard-boiled egg director has no other skills except using public funds. Luke's eyes drifted off as if he had discovered some big, shocking secret. There are many kinds. The Sorcerer Supreme seems to have entered a conversational mood. Her right arm slightly lifted, and a chair automatically slid over. She sat in the chair and talked with Luke face to face. The three sanctuaries often capture strange spirits from other dimensions or other worlds. The standard measure is for them to be returned. The Sorcerer Supreme said patiently. Occasionally, there will be exceptions. For example, when the dimensions overlap and the space are turbulent, many innocent people are unfortunately killed. The soul passes through the gap between the dimension of space and the universe. After judging that there is no danger, the sanctuary will give them a place to stay. Luke adjusted his sitting position, seemingly to make himself more comfortable. The Sorcerer Supreme is the protector of the earth. She and the Temple of the Three maintain not world peace but balance and stability in multidimensional space. The group of sorcerers is generally uninterested in the fierce disputes in the human world. Even if the Third Reich won, colonized the whole world, and promoted extreme race theory, the Temple of the Three and Kamar Taj would most likely not intervene and change the trajectory of history that should have happened. The enemies that deserve their vigilance are the many demons in hell, the dimensional demon gods watching. So, which am I? A target for deportation, or an innocent person in protective custody? Luke asked calmly. You are very strange. Sorcerer Supreme's eyes glowed slightly, and there was a rare hint of doubt on her pale face, where it was hard to distinguish her gender. In this world, there are not many things that could puzzle the Ancient One. She has an infinity stone and can foresee future changes and see through the fog of fate. General Cavill, your soul belongs to a human being, not creatures of other dimensions. This is a fact that has been confirmed after repeated examination. There is no smell of sulfur and no crimson glow. Luke saw the Sorcerer Supreme subconsciously twitched her nose. He was somewhat speechless. The soul has a smell. Can you smell it? He, a non-magical world outsider, indicated that he didn't understand it very well. Before you took Rome, you had no magical talent at all, let alone learning black magic, but now you're different, and your efficiency at drawing on natural energy is terrific. The Sorcerer Supreme narrowed her eyes. She didn't quite understand why Luke had suddenly gone from being a non-magical human to a highly gifted magical amateur. If the other party signs a contract with the Vishanti Trinity, he will pass the threshold of becoming a Grand Master in sorcery. As for Dormammu, he hasn't come out for a long time. Mephisto, after I destroyed one of his human incarnations in Greece last time, I guess the cunning demon had to take some time off. Listening to the Sorcerer Supreme's words, as if it was a family history, talking about the Marvel world's dimensional gods. All the big shots were said one after another. Luke's mouth twitched. He could only say that she was an ancient one. Talking and laughing with these big bosses every day, up to the dimensional demon gods, down to the devils of hell, you had to respect her. The title of the strongest sorcerer on earth is well deserved. So, the Temple of the Three couldn't figure out where I came from. Luke picked his eyebrows and kept his face calm. If the Sorcerer Supreme knew of a certain chatty mercenary who could break the fourth wall, she would probably know where he came from, provided that perhaps the unborn Deadpool had not been cancelled. That's right. The Supreme Master sighed as if with some regret. This is a problem she has never encountered before. Luke's soul didn't belong to this world, but she couldn't find a specific origin. All kinds of strange things that don't make sense at all. Even the Grand Masters of the Temple of the Three had difficulty in giving a reasonable explanation. After a period of investigation, I initially think that you are human, not a creature of another dimension. This is a problem. Because you don't belong to this universe, but you also don't belong to the multidimensional world. So according to the rules, the Temple of the Three can't dispose of you at will. Every human soul should be respected and protected. Just like the sorcerers guarding this planet, this is our mission and cannot be violated. After some discussion, the Temple of the Three chose to observe quietly, and I often watched your movements from Kamar Taj. General Cavill, if you hadn't shown something unusual, you probably wouldn't have seen me in your life, until the moment you held the Infinity Stone. Luke remembered Red Skull and the plane incident when he vaguely felt as if he was being watched. That should be the Sorcerer Supreme herself. The moment you grasped the Tesseract, the Space Stone, the timeline diverged into countless streams. Destiny became obscure, the future with many possibilities kept changing, and fell into a precarious and chaotic state. The Sorcerer Supreme looked at Luke sitting across from her. There were complex emotions in her eyes. She didn't seem to expect such a consequence. Souls from other dimensions, or otherworldly beings, were not uncommon in the three sanctuaries. Some of them were harmless, while others were threatening. The Temple of the Three has its own set of rules for disposal, either receive or destroy them. But Luke is unique, he doesn't belong to any of them. This caused the sanctuaries to fail to deal with the situation on time, which led to worse changes. Then what should I do now? Luke asked curiously. After noticing that the Sorcerer Supreme wasn't showing any apparent hostility, he became much more relaxed. There was still vigilance in his heart, but his words were more casual. Although it sounds like the Temple of the Three is having a hard time with his existence, the Sorcerer Supreme doesn't seem to know how to fix it. I don't know. The Sorcerer Supreme shook her head. She is not omniscient and sometimes confused. This is the reason why I came to find you. Finally getting down to business, Luke thought. Frankly, he would like to reach a consensus with the Sorcerer Supreme. In this way, his existence can become reasonable and legitimate. Then the Temple of the Three will not restrict and supervise him. Superman is indeed powerful. But punching Mephisto, kicking the dimensional demon god, may not end well. Unless Luke can immediately pull out the ultimate Superboy Prime, or Silver Age Superman, the card that could go against the heavens. When you had an unexpected and massive impact on the future, I tried to go back in time and try to change it. Luke's eyelids jumped, and although the Sorcerer Supreme spoke politely, he still noticed the cold meaning between the words. Change things? Does it mean using the time stone to go back in time and fix him? No, you misunderstood what I meant. The Sorcerer Supreme seemed to guess Luke's thoughts, shaking her head and smiling. The past is unchangeable. When it happens, it becomes a fact. If I go back to the past and kill you in the cradle, it wouldn't affect you now. It will only open up a new branch for the line, a world without you. Luke frowned. He seemed to remember, Marvel Studios' time settings are a little different from other movies. If you go back to the past, you can change the setting of the future. So, what did you do? Luke suddenly found that the Sorcerer Supreme was an interesting person to chat with, not refusing to answer any questions, not to mention using vague language like other mystics. Most prophets like to hide the correct answers in confusing words. I can observe the future. Your appearance has brought more than 6,300 different possibilities to the timeline, and the number continues to grow. The Sorcerer Supreme's eyes looked quizzical. In those futures she saw, the other side caused both good and bad impacts. I wanted to choose the best one and fix it as the only ending. But you can't do that. There are no definite answers in countless branches. Sometimes you become the hero of the whole world, and sometimes you become the public enemy of all people. Anyway, you would always shake the world as a whole. But there is one thing in common. No one can stop you in the future, Luke. The power you have is unprecedented, and the room for growth is frightening. I can't reach the end of time and see with my own eyes what you will finally become. Luke pursed his lips. It was all like a simulation game with countless choices. Every decision leads to a different direction for the story. This is why I came to find you. Something like a routine inquiry. The Sorcerer Supreme's eyes slightly condensed, and with a serious face, she said, since there is no other way to solve the problem, let's go back to square one and have a face-to-face conversation. Tell me, Luke, what is your purpose? Luke, who had been listening seriously for a long while, figured out what the Sorcerer Supreme was thinking. She can't use the time stone to smooth out the impact he brought, so she had to speak face to face to determine his intentions and whether his presence would endanger Earth. Just like immigration, the authorities would ask various questions before you could obtain permanent residency. To be honest, I feel like it's more like an exam. Luke smiled and replied, survival is my first goal. Then live a relaxed and secure life, without being distracted by other surprises. The Sorcerer Supreme was silent, seemingly using magic to confirm the truth of these words. A moment later, she asked the following question, what do you think of human beings? A complex creature. The noblest morals and the most despicable means will be embodied in them. Luke picked up the whiskey on the table and drank it in one gulp. The cold liquid refreshed him. I am not some anti-human madman who takes pleasure in depriving others of their right to live. I like to drink Coke, often taste whiskey, and occasionally go to Chinatown to eat Chinese food. No matter how powerful I am, I can destroy the planet with one punch. Still, I always need to satisfy my desires, power, position, and material enjoyment. These are not things I could get by killing and enslavement. The last question. The Sorcerer Supreme nodded, seemingly agreeing with Luke's statement. What will you choose when you encounter a crisis? To protect the planet under your feet or to abandon it? Luke was silent for a moment. If he compared the Marvel world to a game, then he was deciding on his guild's dynamics right now. As he thought before, the sole purpose of the Temple of the Three and Sorcerer Supreme is to guard the Earth. To be more precise, it should be to defend against the alien creatures outside the main universe. For example, the Annihilation Wave bugs in the negative zone that once annihilated the Nova Corps are also a group of more than the usual 5 people. A bizarre group whose strength directly dropped by 90% at the time. Then there was Dormammu in the Dark Dimension, a miserable guy who suffered from Doctor Strange's time cycle and infinite negotiations. It was the same case with those ancient gods, such as the god of black magic, Chthon, the Great Serpent, Set, and so on. They existed 4 billion years ago, as indigenous gods of the Earth, were born in the early ancient comics period, and belonged to the background characters list, with very few appearances. They were plenty powerful, sometimes comparable to the 5 gods of the universe. Due to the defense system established by the Temple of the Three, it was difficult for this group of ancient giants to interfere with the main universe. Therefore, they either leave the Earth or go to other dimensions. The reason why the Sorcerer Supreme could fight against dimensional demons is mainly because of her excellent backing. The Temple of the Three Vishanti, composed of Oshter, Agamotto, and Hoggoth, is worshipped by the many masters of Karma Taj. They were in charge of white magic. Among them, Oshter is an ancient god and has family connections with Gaia, Mother of the Earth. Agamotto is the first Sorcerer Supreme that she nurtured. Therefore, in Luke's view, the Earth was simply one of the most dangerous places in the universe. There was Asgard. Odin, the king of the gods, is the pinnacle of the Heavenly Father class. There the Temple of the Three and the Ancient One, backed by ancient gods. Not to mention Thanos, even if Galactus came, he would still fall back. Why can't there be a third option? Faced with Sorcerer Supreme's last question, Luke's mind turned, and he quickly organized his words. The Ancient One must have a way to ascertain the truthfulness in his words, so deceitful lies wouldn't have any effect. But, truthfully answering, Luke suspects that the Sorcerer Supreme will directly enact a set of infinite time loops after hearing this, putting himself into a hellish state. Therefore, he shouldn't only give a reasonable answer, but also prove that his existence poses no threat to Earth. A third? The Ancient One was a little surprised and asked in a friendly way. Most of the time, she is a very good-tempered master of the mystic arts. Unlike the bunch in the temple who carry shackles, hammers, heavy axes, put all kinds of defense spells on themselves, and then yell and smash demons' heads with their muscles. The Ancient One belongs to the moderate faction, which will only start with reasoning. Physical violence is the communication solution used to deal with stubborn elements. From the good attitude shown by Luke, it seems that he could communicate normally. Therefore, the Sorcerer Supreme is willing to give a little more patience and listen to the other party's explanation. For example, unite as one, unite forces, end the war before it begins, and nip the disaster in the bud. Luke's eyes flashed, trying to look sincere, and said, "The Temple of the Three's enemies are hell demons and dimensional demons. There are far more people behind the scenes who are interested in the Earth. Instead of waiting for the crisis to happen, why not take the initiative to develop and strengthen our strength until we have the confidence to face any storm?" The Sorcerer Supreme shakes her head. As the owner of the Time Stone and having future foresight, she is more inclined to act conservatively. Excessive interference in the timeline will only lead to worse results. The threats among the stars, naturally, has Asgard and Odin to stand up to them. The task of Karma Taj and the temple is to hold our line of defense. The Ancient One replied with a smile. She has dealt with the Allfather several times. The strength of the other party, even in the multiverse, could also be called superior. With Asgard as the solid barrier of the 9 realms, those alien empires and cosmic overlords who dare to provoke should seriously consider the consequences. Centuries ago, Odin, his daughter Hela, and the great might of the Valkyrie army could be said to have swept through the 9 realms. But the twilight of the gods will come, won't it? Luke meaningfully reminded. Earth can't always rely on Odin and the Sorcerer Supreme, as the old powerhouses will have to retire sooner or later. When the time comes, Doctor Strange, who will take over the throne, may not be able to cope with the hidden crisis among the stars. General Cavill, you really know a lot. The Sorcerer Supreme's eyes gazed at him like a sharp blade sweeping through. She is now increasingly curious about Luke's origins. The ancient prophecy of the twilight of the gods was unknown to many, even most people of Asgard. So, what do you want to do? The Sorcerer Supreme asked with great interest. You can change your way of thinking. Luke said in a determined tone like a tireless interviewer trying to promote himself. First of all, Temple of the Three has limited power. You should acknowledge that. The Sorcerer Supreme nodded her head. The number of sorcerers in the groups is less than that of mutants. It's not that the conditions for becoming a sorcerer are harsh. But in modern society, with all the materialistic desires, there aren't many ordinary people who are willing to stay in Kamar Taj to practice for that long. Usually, the purpose is to achieve a goal, such as a cure for a terminal illness, or to get out of a difficult situation and then return to modern society. For this, the Sorcerer Supreme wouldn't stand in the way. We can expand the number of masters, for example, by establishing a specialized educational institution to provide a living force for Temple of the Three. Luke came up with an idea. In this way, the pressure on Karmatage would reduce, and so there would be enough people to deal with hell demons. The Sorcerer Supreme was silent for a moment, thinking about the possibilities. Major General Cavill, there is a price to pay for using magic. It may also cause great harm if that forbidden knowledge spreads. After a long time, the Ancient One shook her head and said so. The magic of the Marvel Universe requires the user to pay the price. The specific process can be seen as a loan. Each time the users use a high-level spell, it is like an additional charge on their bill. White magic allows payment in installments, and the cost wasn't so terrible, so many mages accepted it in Karmatage. And black magic belongs to the loan shark kind, which is very cool when used, but very miserable when the payment is due. The cost of magic can be circumvented, right? There's no need to stick to the old rules. Luke was persuasive. He tried to convince the Sorcerer Supreme. Doom, the master of science and magic in Marvel, tried to pass on the cost of casting spells with machines. The Ancient One herself often gathers the power of Dormammu and secretly transfers the bills she needs to pay to the dark dimension. I'll think about it. This is the end of the question and answer game. The Sorcerer Supreme didn't reject it outright, nor did she nod in agreement. When it comes to difficult decisions, she prefers to be patient and wait for a while. General, for your arrival, I don't know whether it is good news or bad news. However, on my behalf, I welcome you. The Sorcerer Supreme stood up and gave a very modern handshake. Thank you. I hope one day I can set foot in Karmatage. Luke also got up and stood. The Ancient One was the most talkative one amongst all the Sorcerer Supremes from previous dynasties. If the first-generation Sorcerer Supreme, Agamotto, replaced this, he would take him away in an instant. By the way, Ancient One, I have a question. Luke asked curiously. How can you tell if I'm lying or not? Is it some special spell? Because you answered the same question 420 times. The Sorcerer Supreme seemed to be smiling. The eye of Agamotto hanging down on her chest emitted emerald green light. She created a time loop when I wasn't aware of it. Luke was dumbfounded, but it was indeed the Sorcerer Supreme's style of doing things. However, the other party was too patient, and the single infinite cycle wasn't too dull. By the way, General Cavill, I just have one thing I want from you. Before leaving, the Supreme Master smiled mysteriously and faintly said, when foreign people settle permanently, they always have to pay a little something and do something good for the world. You think so, right? 20 minutes later, the office in SHIELD's headquarters was quiet again. Luke shook the empty glass, went to the wine cabinet, and poured himself a glass of whiskey, all of which were high-end goods from Howard. Every time he went to his mansion, the Major General had to order 1 or 2 bottles of good wine, and Jarvis, the housekeeper, was kind enough to tell him the price and year to help him choose. So much so that Howard began to complain that Luke had emptied his stock. The Sorcerer Supreme from Karmatage came quietly and left quietly, with a wave of her sleeves. She only left a few wisps of power. Kong the Conqueror, trouble one after another. Luke leaned his head back and drank it all in one go. With the help of the cold liquid and burning alcohol, he sorted out his chaotic thoughts. Kong the Conqueror, for many, was an unfamiliar name. This guy, like Deadpool's good friend Cable, was someone of the future. He was a supervillain who had never appeared in the movies. Kong the Conqueror himself didn't have any super ability, and his mind was average. So, he wasn't very conspicuous among various villains. The Sorcerer Supreme couldn't mention him precisely because he could travel in time and was an expert in this field. In the comics, Kong the Conqueror often pretended to be a historical celebrity and conquered the world with the help of time machines, high-tech armor, and future weapons. For example, a pharaoh of Egypt or Darius of the Persian Empire made a guest appearance as a superhero. Like Iron Lad. To sum up, Kong the Conqueror was a person who liked to get into trouble. He claims to be the king of kings and is passionate about time travel, ruling one branch world after another. He gave the Sorcerer Supreme a headache. More and more time, branches can lead to unforeseen catastrophes of enormous proportions. Kong the Conqueror will permanently ruin one world, then finds the next one. He enjoyed this boring game. Even with the Ancient One's gentle character, she was so annoyed that she once wanted to kill this opponent with the Time Stone. You can see how much trouble this time travel expert had brought the Sorcerer Supreme. So, Kong the Conqueror took a fancy to my timeline? Luke shook his glass. This is one of the costs of obtaining permanent residency. He must expel Kong the Conqueror or wipe him out completely. Of course, the second option was impossible. Because this bastard's footprints were all over the timelines, killing one, there was always another. His vitality was stronger than that of a cockroach. Otherwise, the Ancient One would have done it herself. This isn't too difficult. Luke agreed with the Sorcerer Supreme. He took care of Kong the Conqueror, and the Temple of the Three and Karma Taj wouldn't come after him. They wouldn't interfere with each other and live in peace. This is still a good deal. Although the title of Conqueror sounded a little bluffing, his strength is quite average. Most of the time, he was relying on future technology to run amok. When encountering real, strong people, he could only flee. For example, the first mutant in history, Apocalypse, once made Kong the Conqueror suffer. Pretending to be Darius, even the 300 Spartan warriors could give him a headache. All Spartans in that timeline were real men who could tear apart tigers and leopards with their hands and carry a lot of weight. As a reward, the Sorcerer Supreme also gave me a spoiler. Luke learned about Atlantis and Namor the Sea King from the Ancient One. As we all know, the two major American comic book studios often borrow and pay tribute to each other's works. Therefore, sometimes it was customary for characters to be highly similar. Namor, the Sea King in Marvel Studio, actually appeared earlier than Aquaman, the seahorse rider next door. Oh no, Arthur Curry. He was the first mutant to appear in the comics and also the first superhero. He was nicknamed the Rip-Off Little Prince, Adulterer, and Double-Crosser. Specific deeds were almost flooded New York and became enemies with Wakanda, was old enemies with Black Panther, and had conflicts with superheroes in the Avengers. He joined the secret organization Illuminati and joined Thanos, whose biggest hobby was to make trouble and cuckold others. He belongs to the type of character that jumps back and forth between superhero and villain. Since Atlantis has appeared, will Wakanda be far behind? Luke let out a long sigh. The whole face of the world began to show. This was the tip of the iceberg. He wasn't nervous but rather full of anticipation. Hellfire Club, Sebastian Shaw, Atlantis, Namor, and Kong the Conqueror. Looks like I'm going to be busy for a while. Thinking silently, Luke added a few names to his notes. I saw the lights in your office was on. Someone pushed open the door of the office. The clacking of high heels came closer and closer. Still not off duty at this hour? The young Major General put his glass down and turned around. Aren't you? The female agent came in with a frown. Her nose twitched, and she said, the office smells like someone else was here. Did you entertain a guest? Maybe before, but now, do you count as my guest? Luke smiled gently. Seemingly aware that the atmosphere felt wrong, the female agent subconsciously took 2 steps back. Then she thought that she had lost momentum. Instead, she held her head high and stared at the eloquent Major General, unwilling to show her weakness. I just came in to see since it's nothing, then I go first. As the manager of S.H.I.E.L.D., Carter is determined to escape from this place. Office romance has always been taboo for her. Besides, Luke is her boss. If people found out, the gossip that had subsided would come flooding back to overwhelm them. Carter didn't want to be labeled as that woman who gets promoted by sleeping with her boss. I'm almost done. I'm getting ready to leave work. Why don't you join me? Luke leaned against his desk and tapped his fingers lightly. I heard that you live in an apartment on Northwest Boulevard, just down the road, and it's early. I can come to your house for a cup of coffee. You won't refuse, will you? Carter pursed her lips. She didn't want to invite Luke to her house for coffee. With her own understanding of this man, the other party would push his luck and make more unreasonable demands. I remembered I had some work to do, so I'm going to work overtime tonight. Carter tried to dispel Luke's other thoughts diplomatically. She couldn't help feeling a little proud when she thought of the other party's disappointed expression. Is that so? Since you're going to work late, it's still working hours. Can you make me a cup of coffee? Luke hung a smile on his lips. I'm not your secretary. Carter mumbled something, but her body still moved. She walked on her heels to the wine cabinet and pulled out a washed mug. By the way, Peggy, I'd like some hand-ground coffee. I'm a bit unaccustomed to the taste of instant coffee. Luke sat down in the chair and called out to the female agent. Instant only. Carter replied stiffly. Carrying a steaming cup of coffee, she placed it heavily on the table. If there's nothing else, I'm going to continue my work. Carter avoided Luke's eyes. Since the last dance, both of them were crazy that night. Looking back on it, the female agent was blushing. Why don't you work overtime here? Luke rested his elbows on the table, his fingers cradled his jaw, and he looked at Carter with fierce eyes. The latter bit her lip and remained silent. The office lights seemed to have dimmed a bit. A flying bird swept through the window, its dark eyes swiveling, looking at the intense struggle between the two mammals inside. The Shield, the headquarters building, stood quietly as the water flowed swiftly along the Potomac River. A small vortex wrapped under the current, flowing into the deeper night. The underground area of Shield, floor -3. This place is forbidden to ordinary agents and civilians. Only Luke, as the director, and Ms. Carter, as the commander, have free access. Many people have guessed that Shield may be conducting some kind of secret research, but it isn't clear what exactly. This is the laboratory where Bolivar's project team is participating in the genetic mapping of mutants. Under this pretext, Luke also applied for an experimental grant from the Congressional Budget Committee. He had to say that the hairs of Congress were easy to pull. He had his staff write up a few reports and bring Bolivar to the White House to give a few speeches about mutants. He could then get hundreds of millions of dollars, which is simply more profitable than robbing banks. In response, the FBI and CIA's leaders could only watch in envy. In the same way, they had to catch a bunch of spies to cheat the funds, get strong evidence, and wantonly preach the threat of war. In recent years, it was hard to impress the president and get him to allocate the money. It was a great advantage over others. No wonder Nick Fury was so fond of embezzling public money. It was so easy to get money, it felt like a dream. Luke thought to himself. When Atlantis emerges, they will be able to get another grant from the White House. Then Hydra, the Inhumans, at that time, he wouldn't have to wait for Skynet's establishment to become a first-class millionaire. It's true that being a SHIELD's director is much more promising than being a Secretary of Defense. Stryker, you should like this place. Luke took the elevator and went all the way down. In the future, William Stryker, who would become a mutant butcher, couldn't be compared to Bolivar's scientific mind and Sabertooth's combat power. But even a piece of toilet paper has its use. Luke believed that Stryker and Bolivar, teachers and students, could collide and create different inspiration sparks. General, are you studying those monsters? Stryker remembered the violent scene when Luke kicked Sabertooth in the cell of the new barracks. The latter's injury was severe, but it didn't take long for him to recover independently, without even looking for a doctor to give treatment. They are called mutants. Luke corrected. Pay attention to what you call them. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that won't be torn to pieces by some bad-tempered mutant. Stryker nodded silently and noted down the word, mutant. As he walked along, he saw many researchers in white coats, walking in a hurry. The more they went inside, the quieter the atmosphere was. General, Dr. Trask is in lab number 3. A person in charge stepped forward. Recently, the whole institute was busy copying the leech serum and worked overtime for several days. Luke nodded his head, indicating that he knew. After finding Sabertooth, he collected the gene fragments of 5 mutants and completed the main quest of opening the 3rd camp. The leech serum that could suppress the ability of mutants was the reward. Not only that, but the next stage of the main quest has also been updated. Main quest. Opening of the third camp, the Legion is back. Requirement. Become the leader of either side of the mutant camp. Reward. Clark Kent's glasses. You mean I could become a big, strong, cheerful journalist at will? Luke saw this award at that time, thinking that he didn't need to disguise himself. He wasn't interested in applying to the Daily Bugle. That's Dr. Trask, who is in charge of everything in Lab 3 and is your supervisor. With Stryker looking left and right, full of curiosity, Luke pointed out Bolivar, who was having a fit of rage. Although he looks angry now, he's a very gentle person in private. Stryker looked at the dwarf scientist and heard every "fuck this" and "fuck that" remark, thinking that he wasn't convinced. You work in Lab 3 and get every information you can about mutants, then join the Weapon X program later. After arranging Stryker, Luke walked toward Bolivar, smiling, and asked, "What's worth getting so worked up about, Dr. Trask?" "Motherfuck, General, you came." Bolivar found a tall figure hanging over him, quickly turned around, and calmly said, "These idiots, I can't even communicate with them properly, just like a human that can't talk to monkeys at the zoo." The dwarf scientist's venomous tongue could occasionally be compared to that of the future Iron Man. Luke had to wave off the researchers, all graduates of prestigious universities, to avoid even more heart-wrenching verbal insults. "How far has the leech serum replication project gone?" The Major General changed the subject. "Geniuses will always have some insufferable defects or faults. Howard, for example, had a family tradition of narcissism and arrogance. In his eyes, military order procurement officers are no different from chimpanzees in human form. And Bolivar is the same. When he found that his researchers couldn't keep up with him, he would swear and make personal attacks at every turn. Many poor newcomers with fragile psychological qualities were even cursed to the point of doubting their lives and crying bitterly." Almost finished. Bolivar held his head high with confidence. From an independent scientist with no funding, no investors, and no personal lab, Dr. Trask is now in charge of many researchers and has all the experimental equipment and office space under his control. He is satisfied with his present treatment and life. The only pity is that Major General Cavill had forbidden him to dissect mutants. "Very good. Keep working hard. I need to develop it into a weapon," Luke said with his head down. Namor, the Sea King, is also a mutant. The leech serum can pose a threat to the other party. After visiting Lab 3 and checking Bolivar's work, Luke turned and went to Lab 2. It is Dr. Arnim Zola's office. He is responsible for deciphering Brood's ancient texts and researching Woden's blood. At the end of the war, the Allies took back all the surviving tank-class soldiers. According to the follow-up observation, more than half of them could only live to 35 years old, and the other half was seriously aging, with an estimated life expectancy of even 3 to 4 years. Such a deep level of depletion had put the military off the idea of mass production. The main reason Luke asked Dr. Zola was to study it because Woden's blood can transform cells at a deeper level, enhancing energy storage and absorption. As for the increase in other areas, the effect on Superman isn't significant. Besides, Rogers is a battleship class. Logically speaking, life consumption will be more serious than tank class. If one could decipher all of Brood's technology, one might be able to find a solution. "I don't see any hope for the time being." Dr. Zola shook his head. The Brood's original intention in developing this technology was to create a weapon of war. The survival period of the experimental subjects wasn't that important to them. Luke nodded and asked Dr. Zola to continue his research. Then he went to Lab 1, Howard's place. The main project is to extract the infinite energy of the Tesseract, about which Dr. Zola provided a lot of ideas. After all, Hydra's energy weapons came from him. The Tesseract seems to have run out of energy and doesn't respond to any external stimuli. Howard was a little upset when he saw Luke coming. He tried many methods, but they all failed. Even Dr. Zola's precious metal instruments that successfully extracted infinite energy are useless now. Luke averted his gaze. This might have had something to do with him. When he held the Tesseract, he had absorbed a lot of energy. Maybe that's why it's in an indefinite standby mode. What's new? Luke, change the subject. I'm starting to think about building a fusion reactor. Is that a new discovery? Howard scratched his head and said, create a circular vacuum chamber with coils wrapped around the outside and then electrify it. In this way, a huge spiral magnetic field could be generated inside. If I heat the plasma to a very high temperature, I can achieve nuclear fusion. If it does, it will be enough to solve a future energy crisis. Then keep up the good work. When you succeed, I'll give you a gift." Luke smiled meaningfully. He did not expect Howard to have the fantastic idea of building a large arc reactor right now. If it can be scaled down, then Iron Man will be able to appear in advance. After visiting the 3 laboratories, Luke turned back to Bolivar's mutant project team. SHIELD's intelligence network hasn't been rolled out yet. It was time-consuming and labor-intensive to unearth and cultivate elite agents. James Bond, Ethan Hunt, Jason Bourne, Yan Shuangying, they were all rare elite cards, and it was expected that they wouldn't be available for a while. As for the hard-boiled egg director, Luke didn't purposely go looking for him. The low-end version of Nick Fury, who hasn't grown up yet, isn't instrumental in recruiting. Anyway, these plot characters will appear sooner or later. After all, as the saying goes, traversing worlds, you need a cheat. That would be the unshakable Coulson. The man with the increasingly dangerous hairline was like a rookie village guide on the Marvel set. He knew everything. "General, he's James Howlett." The person in charge pointed to a tall, strong man with a beard. "Lab 3 is further inside the break area where the mutants are housed. Not long ago, the army found Wolverine, who had been missing for several days. No one knew how he got so far to Japan, and they heard that he almost got hit by the atomic bomb." Luke looked at Wolverine's lively and energetic appearance. He deeply sighed. The self-healing ability is irrational. Wolverine was destroyed by the atomic bomb's high temperature and shockwave, leaving only a skeleton. He could still repair himself. Really fast and efficient. Luke smiled. MacArthur, the commander of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific War Zone, is in charge of the military occupation of the Japan Islands. He heard that the Major General in the US was searching for a missing soldier. The other party was happy to do him this favor. With one command, he mobilized his forces and quickly found Wolverine. A tall white man stood out in Japan. "Congratulations on your brotherly reunion." Luke walked into the rest area, where besides the brothers, Sabertooth and Wolverine, there were some other mutants. They were all paid particular attention to by S.H.I.E.L.D. After a period of investigation, they were contacted and taken in. However, there are very few mutants worthy of being recruited. Not everyone in this particular group of genetic mutations enjoyed the satisfaction brought by having different abilities. Since it is genetic evolution, there are bound to be instances of failure. Mutants also have different levels, the epsilon-level mutants, many of which are typical cases of evolutionary failure. Either the skin color and appearance are altered, or they have significant defects. Luke once saw a child, like a hedgehog. When he was excited, sharp hair like steel needles appeared on his skin. Frankly speaking, this ability not only affects life but is also useless and lacks room for improvement. For that child, it was like a curse. Therefore, he took the initiative to become a leech serum subject and wanted to eliminate his identity as a mutant. There are many similar situations, such as the powerful alpha mutants like Professor Baldhead and Magneto and the gifted omega mutants like Phoenix and Franklin, which were always a minority. More and more people are suffering from genetic mutations, and in their view, mutants were a disease that deserved to die, not a gift from God. According to Bolivar's analysis of the data, 20% of the mutant population is in the epsilon level, which failed in evolution. 50% were delta level with no significant defects but weak ability. The number of alpha level mutants may be only 10%. As for the legendary omega level, it belonged to the golden card class, which rarely appears. Therefore, it was ridiculous for Sebastian Shaw and Magneto to build a mutant kingdom and a powerful world-ruling kind of regime. This is because there is no way to compensate for the genetic defects of the mutant population alone. Not to mention normal reproduction and population increase. "Thank you for helping me find Jimmy, General." Sabertooth thanked Luke while calling his brother's nickname and acting as a brother. Wolverine standing beside him was dumbfounded, wondering if there was something wrong with his ears. It was unbelievable that Victor, his grumpy brother, should say the words, "Thank you. I thought you were just going to curse again." Wolverine couldn't resist spitting and was directly elbowed in the abdomen by his older brother Sabertooth. The latter smiled stiffly and tried to show his docile side. Sabertooth did this to avoid being pulled over and sliced up by the dwarf scientist named Bolivar. These days, that damned dwarf is always looking back and forth at himself with eagerness, as if he's wondering which part of his body would be better to cut. Sabertooth was already scared enough to leave a trauma. He couldn't fight his way out, and he had to endure Bolivar's covering eyes every day. This is no way to live. If Luke hadn't been there, Sabertooth would have to complain to his brother, Wolverine. Sabertooth. Do you know how I spent my days lately? Wolverine. Shaking his head. Sabertooth. You'll find out soon. Wolverine. James Howlett, let me see your ability. Luke glanced at the young Uncle Wolf. When he saw the sharp bone claws, he couldn't help feeling pity. Wolverine, with no adamantium metal injected into its body, doesn't live up to the name. Since both of you are here, come on, and let's practice together. After a few casual exchanges, Luke took off his coat and moved his muscles and bones. These days, thanks to Sabertooth as a sandbag for practice, Deathstroke's skill card, Master Assassin, has almost become muscle memory. Fight? Can you, General, forget it. Anyway, we aren't your opponent. Sabertooth interrupted his brother's death flag. He understood very well that the so-called sparring was to be a human sandbag. Even if there's a self-healing factor in his body, and the injury would recover. He isn't a masochist who liked to be beaten, so there's no need to experience being beaten that badly. Wolverine looked at his old brother in shock, his eyes filled with disbelief. Is this the Victor the First? No? What on earth happened to him these days? How did you become so polite and friendly? Wolverine suspected that this wasn't his grumpy brother but someone else, with a string of suspicions popping up. Then let James come first. Mutants here all have a code name, you can take one too. Luke was too lazy to pronounce his name and said, how about, Logan, use your middle name. No problem. You are the boss here, you have the final say. Wolverine's eyes dimmed, nodding in agreement. James and Logan are both his father's names. Victor, you don't look like a tough guy now, aren't you good at fighting? Wolverine, who got a new name, laughed and then said, General, if I hurt you, will I be locked up? Luke shook his head and smiled. No, Logan. To be honest, it's been a long time since I've experienced the feeling of being hurt, and I'd be happy if you could let me relive it. On the contrary, General, I am injured almost every day. Wolverine. Logan grinned. His whole body revealed a bit of wildness. He isn't as violent as his brother Sabertooth, but his temper wasn't mild. He remembers that when Professor Charles and Magneto searched for fellow mutants, they found Wolverine and just introduced themselves. They only got a, fuck you, back. Directly letting the leaders of the two mutant camps return without success. It's no wonder that later when Magneto saw Wolverine, he was severely beaten. It must have been more than a grudge. Be careful, Jimmy. Sabertooth patted his younger brother on the shoulder and told him, when you find that you can't resist, you can try to enjoy that feeling. It won't hurt too much, only for a while. Logan was puzzled by his brother's remarks. Then, he followed Luke into the spacious reinforced training room made of alloy. Not long after, there was a continuous booming sound that came from inside. Victor, guess how long your brother could last? A big, burly man asked. His name is Fred, and his code name is Blob. His own strength is endless, and his physical defense is fantastic. He once tried to punch back a shell fired by a tank. Usually, besides Sabertooth, this guy was also one of the sparring partners. He is mainly responsible for taking punches and giving Luke practice punches. Jimmy said, 20 minutes. Sabertooth crossed his arms in front of his chest. This was his first achievement. The demon-like Major General had been beating him for over 20 minutes. It almost drained him. When he walked out of the training room, his legs were weak, as if he had lost all his strength. I think he could last a little longer than you. A Texan man laughed. His name is John, and his code name is Kestrel. Like Azazel, he can move instantly, but the range was much smaller than the other party. I think so too. The last speaker was a young girl named Kayla, codename Silver Fox, who can control other people's thoughts through physical contact. These mutants are the suitable candidates found by S.H.I.E.L.D. recently. They had all revealed their identities before, so the agents quickly discovered them. As Luke led S.H.I.E.L.D., the attitude towards mutants wasn't as brutal as Bolivar Trask or William Stryker. He prefers to use gentle tactics, to package himself as a kind man. Unless he was facing a cranky old man, he would fight and skip the small talk. One hit, and it's over. Therefore, these mutants, who have special abilities, are favored by S.H.I.E.L.D. They completed their recruitment without much resistance. Of course, this is also related to the fact that Bolivar had been taken under Luke's wing. Mutants in the 20th century encountered two crises. First, they were captured by Bolivar as the material for studying Sentinel robots. Second, Stryker's research on Weapon X also persecuted and massacred them on a large scale. The mutants, which the capitalist society hadn't educated, hadn't reached a serious level of hostility towards humans and the military for the time being. Sabertooth was quiet. He didn't think his brother could be better than him. When it came to killing people and fighting, it's apparent that he should be better. Phew, Victor, your brother is such a stubborn guy. After the warm-up period, Luke walked out of the training room with a satisfied expression. Sabertooth glanced at the time, 34 minutes. Damn, I lost to that weak Jimmy. Sabertooth, an older brother, was a little upset and took the initiative to apply for a beating. General, do you want to continue? I can hold on longer? Luke was refreshed and had a good vent. He looked at him strangely. What's going on? Addicted to being beaten? You've been a sparring partner for a week now, Victor. Are you sure you want to continue? Luke asked. Yes, it's an honor to fight with you, General. Sabertooth nodded. How could he lose to Jimmy? He had to prove himself. It doesn't matter if he was beaten. Luke raised an eyebrow and wondered if he had brainwashed Sabertooth. Considering the positive attitude of the other party, the Major General, who had just completed his warm-up, couldn't reject him. Well then, I hope you'll make some progress. Luke turned and walked into the training room, and Victor eagerly followed him. Crackle. Rumble. The violent sounds penetrated through the training room. Even with its excellent sound insulation, it transmitted outside. The rest of them looked at each other. Fred, the blob, closed his eyes and showed some sympathy. Having been a punching bag a few times, he could imagine Sabertooth's tragic end. 40 minutes later, the spar was over. Luke was full of energy as he strode out. The mutant brothers weren't so bad. He could force him to exert 50% of his powers. Anyway, as long as he doesn't cut off their heads and crush their hearts, they could heal quickly. Okay, the exercise is over. Luke clapped his hands, ignored Sabertooth and Wolverine lying inside, cleared his throat, and said, Let's get to know each other. My name is Luke Cavill. You should all have heard of this name. In the days to come, you can call me Sir or General. The free and scattered mutants, who had been separated from each other, stood together and listened attentively to the young general's words. They have heard a lot about Luke since S.H.I.E.L.D. recruited them. The other party is a celebrity, a war hero, Superman, and other titles. Like a bright halo, incomparably dazzling. In addition to S.H.I.E.L.D.'s identity and powerful personal strength, he was a person no one could provoke. After all, not every mutant is as violent as Sabertooth. The existence of mutants is no secret to S.H.I.E.L.D. As Luke talked, he took out Constantine's expert in deception skill card and used it. Many people may think you're freaks and deviants, but that's not true. Mutants are just a branch of the evolutionary path of humankind. You're no different from us. Genetic evolution has given you special abilities, not for hiding or escaping, it's an innate mission. Join the military, serve your country, and put the power you have to reasonable use. That's the future of mutants. Constantine's ability to fool, coupled with Luke's pep talk, quickly made these young mutants' blood pump and emotions stir. Compared to Sebastian Shaw's extreme theory, the world belonged to mutants and rebellion against human tyranny. The Major General's speech is much more moving. However, the latter didn't overemphasize loyalty to the country but put S.H.I.E.L.D. and himself in a higher position. General, will we be sliced up by Dr. Trask? Big Fred asked. Every mutant had this concern. Why would he slice you up? You're all valuable assets of S.H.I.E.L.D. You were trained, nurtured, and spent money on every day. These expenses are almost comparable to several bombers. Luke seemed to find it ridiculous and asked rhetorically, Did I spend all this money just to put you guys on the autopsy table? Fred scratched his head and smiled. The Major General's answer made him feel relieved and gave him a sense of belonging in S.H.I.E.L.D. General, are we still free? Kayla, the young girl, raised her hand like a student and asked. I'm sorry, but no, Luke shook his head. You can go out and have regular holidays, even travel around the world. But you still belong to S.H.I.E.L.D. from mind to body. Ladies and gentlemen, the federal government has different views on mutants. Some people think you are freaks and are ticking time bombs. S.H.I.E.L.D. provides you with protection from trouble and asks something in return. Obey orders and never betray until retirement. This is the price. Luke didn't just take a gentle tone. He was hard when he needed to be hard, soft when he needed to be soft. Both go hand in hand. This is the basic quality of a leader. Understood, General. Kayla silently put down her hand. Luke took an extra look at the young girl, not because she was pretty. According to the information from S.H.I.E.L.D., the other party had a sister named Emma Frost, the White Queen of the Hellfire Club. The sisters were similar to Sabertooth and Wolverine, and both had identical mental abilities. Starting from today, you have all been incorporated into Task Force X. Luke said seriously. The only task is to search and track a secret organization called the Hellfire Club. Anna Maria Island, on the beach. Namor, who had 2 strong arms exposed, walked under the parasols carrying a surfboard. As an Atlantean who could breathe underwater, he didn't need it at all. But in order to make himself look normal and not attract other people's attention, Namor always brought a surfboard with him and pretended to be a surfer. Mr. Shaw, you're here too. Compared with the coldness of the last meeting, Namor took the initiative to greet him this time. These days, he often chatted with this middle-aged man who claimed to be a German scientist. Namor is always impressed by the ideas that the other party occasionally threw out. Like a lost ship, he suddenly saw the light from a lighthouse from the darkness of the sea. Unknowingly, Namor came to see Sebastian Shaw as a life mentor, with a little more respect in his heart. The warm Florida sunshine isn't often seen in the cold climate of Berlin. Sebastian took off his dark glasses and smiled kindly. Because of the Third Reich's high-handed policies, there's a tension in the atmosphere. Everyone is worried that they might be the next victim of persecution and execution. War is a terrible thing. Don't you think so, Namor? Namor, who had put down his surfboard and sat next to Sebastian, nodded his head. He also hated the war. In the past, the Allies and Axis powers threw mines and bombed submarines everywhere in the Pacific and Atlantic waters, which caused a lot of trouble for Atlantis. It's like someone fighting and quarreling in front of your house every day. If Atlantis didn't hold on to the conservative and reclusive old ideas and didn't want to communicate with the outside world, Namor would definitely teach these people a lesson. As for joining the Allies or the Axis powers, it depended on his mood. Mr. Shaw, do you think a powerful person must hide himself? After these days of in-depth communication, Namor began to let go of his defenses and trust Sebastian Shaw. Of course, there were psychological hints from Emma, the White Queen. And Namor had his own reasons. His father was a captain. When he went to the Antarctic to explore, the route was blocked, so he ordered the sailors to blow up the ice floes but ended up injuring the Princess of Atlantis and brought her to the ship for treatment. After that, it was the usual soap opera tragic romance story. The captain thought that the Princess of Atlantis was very pure and unpretentious. She was different from all the American girls she had known before. The Atlantis princess had no contact with the outside world and knew almost nothing about human beings, so she was easily seduced by the ship's captain. The two of them fell in love, got married, and did everything they had to do. However, when the king of Atlantis saw that his daughter hadn't returned for several months, thinking that something had happened, maybe being kidnapped or abducted by human beings, he directly dispatched his army, found their whereabouts, and killed everyone, including the ship's captain. A few months later, the widowed princess gave birth to Namor. This is the tragic story of the Sea King on Marvel's side. If there are similarities, it's purely for reference. When Sebastian appeared, he played the role of a knowledgeable mentor and instantly brought Namor into the equation. Why would influential people want to hide themselves? Would lions hide among a flock of sheep to make themselves look harmless? Unless it's to hide from hunters. Sebastian smiled. So many days of brainwashing finally took effect. Before he came into contact with Namor, he learned about Atlantis through Hydra. Namor's skin color is different from that of a normal Atlantean, which caused him to be discriminated against by his people and considered a lower-class deviant. To protect her son, the princess had to take Namor to the slums and later to Manhattan. When the king grew old, he remembered that he had a grandson, so he called Namor, who had grown up, back to him. After a series of struggles and battles for the throne, Namor was finally recognized as the ruler of the Four Seas and the new king of Atlantis. Some of this information is the information held by Hydra, and some are the intelligence that Emma, the White Queen, heard by going deep into his mind. All in all, Atlantis had just completed the transfer of power. The old king died, and Namor succeeded. There were still many old conservative forces in the nation, and it was in a relatively chaotic state. Namor, who ascended to the throne, never received royal education. He grew up in slums and land and was confused about how to be a king. Namor. Do you remember the mutants I mentioned before? They have all kinds of special abilities. So, they could be said to be gifted and pioneers on the path of evolution. Sebastian sat up, left the deck chair, and said, word for word, but they have driven away and hunted by humans. Why is that? Because they lack a leader. A king who can unite the mutants around him and give them the courage to stand up against tyranny. Feeling Sebastian's expectant eyes, Namor couldn't help but feel the illusion of, I'm that guy. The fierce emotions were like roaring waves, one after another, washing away what little sanity he had. Mr. Shaw. Namor hesitated to disclose his status as a mutant. He had no sense of belonging to Atlantis for the time being, and he knew nothing about being a good king. Hearing Sebastian talk about the plight of his fellow mutants, Namor felt compassionate and wanted to be the 1-in-a-million leader. Namor, if I'm not mistaken, you're a mutant, right? Sebastian struck while the iron was hot and sincerely said, when I saw you at the beach bar before, I had a subtle hunch, Namor, you're the one I'm looking for. We are compatriots. Genes are far more reliable than the bonds of blood. Namor, who just wanted to tell him about his identity, looked shocked and asked in surprise, Mr. Shaw, are you a mutant, too? The latter nodded and smiled, not only me but also Miss Frost, whom you met before. We formed the Hellfire Club together. The purpose is to save the suffering compatriots, resist the tyranny of mankind, and build a beautiful world belonging to mutants. Namor frowned as he remembered the conversations he'd had with Sebastian over the past few days. It was mostly about race, genetics, evolution, and other issues. Maybe Mr. Shaw had been testing him. Was he testing him? That's right. Sebastian affirmed. His sharp eyes pierced Namor's heart as if he could see through people's hearts. You are the leader the mutants have been waiting for. The king who will save his people and lead us to a new future. Although Stanislavski hasn't written, an actor prepares yet at this time, Sebastian Shaw thoroughly explained what superb acting was with determined eyes and a sincere tone in his voice. He was almost convinced by himself, let alone Namor. Why me? Namor, who no one had ever recognized since he was a child, seemed flattered and asked back. You're both an Atlantean and a mutant. You're the only bridge connecting the two worlds underwater and on land. Sebastian replied, selectively ignoring the fact that Namor still has some human blood in his body. Join us, Namor. When the time comes, the Atlantean civilization could rule the world together with the mutants. You occupy the 4 oceans, and we would own land. When faced with this invitation, a strange voice deep inside Namor's heart kept urging him to say yes. Mr. Shaw, I am willing to participate in the great cause of saving our compatriots. The fooled Sea King pursed his lips, nodded, and replied. Very well. Welcome to the Hellfire Club. Sebastian held out his hand. His downcast eyes flashed with a hint of light. Finally, Atlantis was tied to his ship. The next step was to seek revenge from Superman. Before that, the account in Rome hasn't been settled yet. Luke, who is staying in Washington, D.C., is still unaware of the news that the Hellfire Club had added a new member. An Atlantean and the mutants have allied. Although he had started searching for Sebastian Shaw's whereabouts, it's difficult to accurately locate a mutant without Professor Charles and the brainwave amplification device. The artificial satellites wouldn't be launched until the two superpowers start their arms race. What Project Insight? What global surveillance? In this era, even science fiction writers wouldn't think that up. As for contacting Atlantis, it was even more impractical. It has been almost 9 years since the first nuclear submarine, the USS Nautilus, was launched. Currently, the maximum depth to which humans could dive didn't exceed 1,000 meters. For an underwater civilization, this was still far away from their front door. That's why we say that technology changes lives. Luke silently lamented. Compared to the future of steel armor, air and space carriers flying everywhere, this era of technological development seemed backward. So, he specifically urged Howard to put aside the Tesseract research for the time being and shift his focus to the fusion reactor. Bring out the nuclear submarine, and then consider launching a satellite. Skynet is a communications company anyway. In the future, if the Kree fleet invaded and destroyed their satellite, Ronan the Accuser will see what Superman's Iron Fist was like. Luke's vision has always been looking forward. He's even thinking about asking Howard to scale down the arc reactor. In the future timeline, Tony Stark's phrase, "I am Iron Man," officially opened the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Instead of waiting until that day, Luke thought it would be nice for Howard to complete this thing. It's all in the family anyway. As for the technical bottleneck, he believed it would be easy to solve the problem by visiting Wakanda first. Then, establish a diplomatic relationship and friendly exchange with Atlantis. These two countries, in addition to the Fantastic Four's old rival, Dr. Doom's hometown of Latveria, could be called the most high-tech places on Earth. Not to mention nuclear fusion technology, time travel, steel army, and spacecraft could be completed. "General, that's Lake Alkali," the accompanying striker shouted. The whirring of the helicopter, combined with the strong air current, forced him to do so. "It's a great place." Luke looked down from midair at the concrete dam standing tall. It was nestled between snow-capped mountains and dense forests. This was once an industrial area, but it was abandoned during the Great Depression. Later, the military was interested in it and bought it in the name of building a dam. Stryker explained at the top of his lungs. Luke wanted to say that he didn't have to shout so loudly, he could hear him. Superman would never be deaf enough to need him to do that. When World War II began, the Department of Defense, fearing a Third Reich attack on their homeland, began to build strong and reliable military bases throughout the country, one of which was in Lake Alkali. Pointing to the concrete dam, Stryker said, "War supplies were stored deep in the dam, but unfortunately, they were never put to good use. Now that the war is over, these bases have lost their original function. The Pentagon generals took over responsibility for the allocation. Of course, only you, General, would have the honor to use a military base large enough to withstand a missile bombing as a laboratory." In the latter part of his speech, Stryker deliberately praised him. This upright-looking soldier was well versed at flattering others. "It's just the generals showing some mutual respect," Luke said humbly. In the current Pentagon, who didn't know that the recently established SHIELD's director was a young general who was good at reaching out to Congress for funding. From cultivating the Super Soldier Rebirth project, researching the Weapon X project, churning out the Space Exploration project, one after another, he was close to draining the budget committee. The most annoying thing was that, in the face of Luke's insatiable demands, they couldn't refuse. The reason was that those programs seemed to be very promising and worth investing a lot of money into. Howard, who heard the news, laughed with Luke. He said that if Luke were to mingle in Wall Street, he would undoubtedly be able to cheat countless investors. At this, the Major General smiled but didn't say anything. He learned this from a Chinese entrepreneur who kept avoiding his return to the country and facing indictment. The first plan out a big profitable-looking project, excite the concept and look for a few well-known scientists to support it. The White House and the group of politicians in Congress would naturally fork out the money obediently. "I was weeding out capitalism," Luke's feelings of guilt. "William, who do you think is most deserving of development in Task Force X?" The helicopter landed slowly. Luke stepped on the soft snow and exhaled a white breath of air. He was dressed thinly but didn't feel cold. Wrapped tightly, Stryker rubbed his hands, looking enviously at the Major General walking in front of him. Was this Superman's physique? "Logan, of course," Stryker answered without thinking. The same mutant, the young officer, seemed to have a fondness for Wolverine. Every time he saw those bone claws, his eyes showed a hint of yearning. So much so that when the two mutant brothers communicated privately, Sabertooth said that the dwarf scientist Bolivar was a pervert who always stared at him with a strange look. Wolverine thought that Stryker was more disgusting. The two brothers looked at each other and felt a chill down their spines. "They can't go on like this, Logan. Have you taken a fancy to his self-healing ability?" Luke wasn't surprised at all. Stryker and Wolverine are destined for each other. "Yes. I think Logan can be turned into an invincible killing machine. Sabertooth is too irritable, and his emotions would affect his judgment, but Logan is different. His claws, the wildness in his eyes, and the stubbornness in his bones. He was simply born to fight." Stryker is thrilled to be involved in Bolivar's research and to learn more and more about mutants. As a soldier, almost subconsciously, the young officer considered applying the X gene to his weapons. "General, the Pentagon's attitude towards mutants is far less gentle than yours." Stryker followed Luke deep into the snow and wondered, the use of mutants for weapons research could yield more results in a shorter period. But you don't seem to want to do that. After these days of getting to know him, Stryker figured out part of the Major General's temperament. Most of the time, the other party was easy to talk to and never showed an angry look. Strangely enough, This didn't affect the respect and admiration that other people had for Luke. Stryker attributed this to personal charisma. The head of the Third Reich thought the same way, which is why they used Jews and Poles to test the poison gas and conduct human experiments. Luke pushed open the heavy steel gate and entered the flood control passage. Deep inside this concrete dam, there's something else. All kinds of war supplies, ventilating facilities, weapons, and ammunition are readily available. It was more like a nuclear bomb or a doomsday preparation. It's easy to plant a seed of hatred, but it's hard to get two races to live in harmony with each other. Luke's voice echoed in the empty dam base. I want to be a bridge, not a butcher.